unknowing, or agnosia, is not ignorance or nations as ordinarily understood, but rather the realization that no finite knowledge can fully know the infinite one, and that therefore it is only truly to be approached by agnosia. Taking us into the unknown today is author Craig Williams. This is the Agnosia Podcast. Hello, everybody. Welcome to the podcast. Joining me today on Agnosia is Craig Williams, author of Tantra Physics, Volume 1 and 2, Entering the Desert, and Cult of Golgotha. Craig is also a practitioner of Ayurvedic medicine, acupuncture, Vedic sciences. He's an ordained Gnostic bishop and a martial artist. Craig, thank you for joining me on the show today. It's truly an honor.
It's an honor to be here. Thank you so much for having me on.
Yeah. So one of the things that we talked about in Messenger, one of the places I wanted to start was with you being a martial artist. Recently, in a class I was in, my current teacher was talking about, how as occultists, well, not even as occultists, but, just as human beings, we miss out so much on the different bodies of knowledge, and one of those being, he was talking about how he was talking about body as a sense organ. And I was hoping that, as a martial artist and as a runner, and I know you keep physically fit, what your thoughts on the wisdom of the body informing the soul is. Can you speak to that?
What a great question. Thank you for opening up with that one. Yeah, I would say that the majority of my life's work has been exploring that concept of the embodiment of consciousness. And that's it's a fundamental idea within Tantra. And then it's definitely a fundamental idea in ideas of martial arts, Kung Fu, Tai Chi, Qigong, all those East Asian philosophies and their amalgam, or we could say even their alchemy. So I think that, two key ideas jump up first. One would be like you said, your teacher mentioned the importance of the body as a container. We talk about it being a container for some people use the word spirit, other people would say consciousness, and then sometimes that term, the soul gets kind of thrown around a bit. So sometimes I like to be very specific about, and I tend to use Sanskrit words, or based in Vedic gnosis, and we talk about the Atman, or the soul. That would be the root base for our consciousness. And as Krishna says in the Bhagavad Gita, the Atman is never, it can't die because it was never born.
Right.
It's outside of time and space. So our embodied mind sometimes struggles with that or doesn't struggle with that, and that can determine how serious someone is on their path to spirituality. But so the soul kind of sits in the background as our life unfolds. But then we also have the ego, the ahamkara, which in Sanskrit means the I identifier or the I maker. And that's our individualized, crystallized consciousness, which kind of exists in this physical body. And so there's a beautiful synergy between the physical body, the nervous system, what we call the mind, and then what we would call the pranic body, or maybe some systems would call the astral body. And then in Ayurveda, there's 7, right? There's 7 different bodies, or 5 koshas interacting all kind of back and forth. And so, like you said, I think oftentimes in our society now, or in the world, not just even in the contemporary world, but throughout history, the body has either been seen as a sacred temple, or it's been seen something that is a prison. Right. And that's something I write about a lot too. It's like, when I talk about Gnosticism, or my unique angle to Gnosticism and Tantra, both, is to see the body as a sacred space, and not I don't see embodiment as a prison at all. I see it as a rare opportunity for us to learn through the flesh, learn through the body, this beautiful interaction we have with nature, and how it informs our nervous system and how we grow. Those are really big lessons for us to learn.
Absolutely.
Being born, and then we age, and then we die. And then there's all these mysterious things happen along the way. But I think that the concept of our spirituality growing by us embracing our embodiment is extremely important.
Right. Yeah.
That's underlies all of my work, and that underlies all of, even I would say, even my dharma in the health field, is to help people understand that and not struggle with that. And then absolutely, I would say that my journey in martial arts from a child until now, in all the aspects of Kung Fu, Wing Chun, Tai Chi, and Qigong, all those are intimately related to how my body is functioning and how my nervous system is functioning and how I'm breathing and how all those things can contribute to a specific state of mind that allows me to reach different levels of understanding.
Yeah. Let me digress for just a second, because you mentioned Wing Chun. So there is a book, and I forget the title now, by William Lung, one of Ip Man's students, and he quotes him. And we had to, this was required reading for me a long time ago when I thought I was a practitioner of Wing Chun. And he says, a good teacher doesn't add to a system, but knows how to take away the inessentials.
Yes.
Can you, does that inform the way that I know you as a teacher, does that inform your teaching both in, say, Gnosticism and, even Buddhism and even martial arts?
Yeah, what an interesting comment for him to say. A lot of that's reflective of the overall gestalt or paradigm of Wing Chun, was that it was kind of paring down the system. And that greatly influenced Bruce Lee to go on and develop his ideas with Jeet Kune Do, which was always about kind of refining and simplifying. And, he's very famous to be on it was in the 60s, and it was one of his first appearances on the television show. And the reporter asked him, can you please explain the difference from jujitsu and Kung Fu? And, he kind of smirked. And now this was jujitsu back in the 60s. It was different than what it is today. They kind of probably just meant more general wrestling. And he said, it's a beautiful art, but, and he commented, he said, in jujitsu, someone grabs me on my collar, and then 14 moves later, I get free. And then he said, in Kung Fu, if someone grabs my collar, I crush their foot.
Right.
But what he was trying to say was that I go for the simplest action as I can. And which is very obviously, there's many ideas in Eastern philosophy which inform that. So he was, they were all influenced with that. But I think that brings up a good point, is what we hope for with systems, particularly complex systems like any East Asian system of martial arts. They're not easy at all.
No.
We're always trying to learn something in a different way and move your body in a different way. But this can be said the same thing of learning Sanskrit or learning Tantra or learning Heidegger or examining all of Carl Jung's works. All those, it's such a large body of work, and it can be ominous. So a good teacher can help that become digestible to the student. And in many, a good teacher can pre-digest a little bit and give little pieces, and then help the student get a taste for it, and they start to develop a certain palate. And so we want to try to help the student, wherever they are, to get a certain palate where they'll not only appreciate and savor the complexity, but start to crave it a little bit. And that's very challenging, right? That's a lot of work being a teacher.
No doubt.
Trying to find what is it about each person that can be that little aha moment. Everybody likes to say that now, the aha moment, but that's true. What is it that causes a light bulb to go off where they can see connections where before they were just seeing confusion?
Right.
And William Chun was really into that. He was always trying to make Wing Chun very, very systematic, efficient system.
Right. Yeah. It's interesting. That makes me think of the fact of, for one, like starting any path, and again, this is another digression, but, here we are. There's that notion that when I started working with non-duality, one of my first teachers in that work was, he told me in super simple exercise, but its implications are profound. When you drink, like when you're drinking your morning cup of coffee, what's doing the drinking,
Yeah.
And it's like, get away from who's the drinker and all that, and just be the drinking of the coffee, and it's that simple enjoyment, so when you said that, it made me think about that, and I just had to share it,
that you bring up, that's a really good point. That's something that we are constantly talking about. For example, when we talk about qigong, right? There's all these things going on that we're moving our body in a certain way. There's a physical adjustment, but there's also a breath adjustment, and then there's a mindset. They sometimes call it the three adjustments, and then they can be so separated, but we're trying to get them to coalesce into a higher thing that it just does it. It's doing it on its own. You don't even realize that doing it. And even in Sanskrit, we call that ajapa japa. That means the mantra says itself. The sadhaka, the practitioner, has to repeat the mantra over and over, that after a while, it just starts repeating itself spontaneously in the inner consciousness. And that's when you kind of awaken the mantra. So those ideas are very important.
Yeah.
Sure.
Another thing, so bridging on that, there's, I have to imagine you're already familiar with the term angiogenesis.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I was just recently, reading and looking at a couple of videos on running and things like that, and they were talking about there's new studies that talk about the fact that running, in fact, breeds angiogenesis. Any one thing we can look at goes back to our work, I suppose. And this is one of those places that I love so much. It's a paradox of, here we are exhausting our lungs and exhausting the respiratory system. And at the same time, it's literally creating, new blood vessels. If I understand the term correctly. Is that what that means? Yeah.
Yeah. That's one of the things we, as a runner and as a running coach, we're always trying to develop someone's aerobic base, right? And that is what happens is, as over the years of training, we start to build this deep aerobic base. But what that means is we're starting to literally create new mitochondria in our cells and new capillary beds and different. And the body just starts to form this web of different ways to get blood to the muscles, to get oxygen to the muscles, and get carbon dioxide away, get it to our lungs, and even the heart, right? We call that the stroke volume, the strength of the heart to squeeze the blood out in its pumping action. Over time, it gets stronger and grows thicker so that it's more efficient, and that all happens just while we're just running. And it's pretty miraculous. And there are some really interesting studies on neuroplasticity in the brain and cardiovascular exercise and running, and I'm sure that's one of the reasons why you see so many things. I saw a new recent study where it was from the Journal for the American Medical Association. They were saying if people were running or brisk walking for just 10 minutes a day, caused mood improvement, right?
Yeah.
So great, right? And so that's happening through the circulatory mystery we have, and mystery of the heart. And it's amazing what that does. And you just have to get people to to be comfortable enough where they can experience that.
Right. And sorry.
If you can run somewhere in nature, even better, somewhere beautiful.
Right. Yeah. It's funny you said nature, because that's going to bring me to the next question I have for you, which is, and let me bridge that with this. Are you familiar with the story of Angulimala?
What's that?
Angulimala?
I don't think so.
Okay, so last month, while my teacher was giving a class, he was talking about Angulimala, which this was, he was, and I'm going to get the error wrong, but I want to say it was during the time, like I want to say around the second Buddha. But what happens is, and I might have that error wrong, but Angulimala was a serial killer, and what he was doing was he was collecting fingers from the dead to put on his mala that he was doing.
Okay.
And so what happens is he encounters the Buddha, and like before he encounters the Buddha, he says, he's on finger 107, and he's like, today I'm getting my final finger, so I'll have this complete. And I want to say he was like a Bond sorcerer, so his teacher at the time was teaching him something to do to use that mala for, and
would definitely be Bond, for sure.
And so he says, whoever decides to walk in my pathway today, that's going to be 108. And as it happens, Buddha was walking, and he comes and he sees Angulimala sharpening his sword, and Angulimala realizes that this is Buddha, and I'm given the condensed version, and he says, hey, he's hollering from a distance, stop coming at me, I don't want to take your finger, and what happens is eventually, Buddha gets face to face with him, and he says, why did you keep coming at me? And Buddha responds something to the effect of, I haven't moved. It's you who are moving, and it's one of those things. And, initially when I heard the story, I was thinking about the fact that, Buddha's telling Angulimala, you're still moving towards bad karma, and, you're still going down this path. I am at peace and at rest. But at the same time, one of the other things that happens, and again, like as I sat there and meditated on it a little bit, this non-dual idea of, I don't move through space moves around me. It brings me to the question that I have for you in the books, both Entering the Desert and in Cult of Golgotha. Nature and space have a supreme importance, the mountain, lake, and cave. And so I'm curious, what in your way of viewing nature and in your way of viewing it, reality, what is space, from an inner and an outer perspective?
Yeah, that's a very interesting, you're asking very interesting questions. Thank you so much. Yeah, the concept of space, akash, or space, is very important because space mirrors consciousness, in the sense is it seems it's ambient, it's everywhere, but it's hard to define, and it contains everything, and that we can move in any direction, and it exists depending on what dimension you're in. It can exist outside of time. So there has some very interesting things with that. And space also implies, it seems limitless, but then in our mind, we tend to think of containers of space. We tend to think of something which contains it. And that's even one of the concepts in Golgotha, Cult of Golgotha, is that the hill of Golgotha, even is the skull. The skull is a container of space. It's a container of consciousness. Just like our body is a type of sheath, or we call that kosha, or container in Sanskrit. And then nature is a container of the five elements. And so, and as we engage with it, the five elements are within us, and we have a certain alchemical relationship with that. And I've always been fascinated with that. And then I'm always fascinated at how nature geographically mirrors spiritual concepts, of the mountains as the spine, caves as spaces in our brain, or hidden spaces in the body, whether we call them chakras or point chodes or marma points. They're all existing in this area. And then it brings up another idea about that, as our consciousness expands, so does our ideas of reality, and so does our perception of space. And I think that I'm personally much more interested in the topography and the exploration of inner space than I am of what we would call outer space.
Yeah, for sure. For sure.
And I think outer space is fascinating.
Yeah.
Even as a practitioner of Jyotish, Vedic astrology, I have an intimate relationship with the planets, or we call them grahas, but I'm still more fascinated with how those are acting inside of us.
Yeah.
Than I am about, getting on a Mars mission and walking on Mars or something.
Yeah.
Great question. Very interesting idea about our relationship to space, where it exists.
And it's one of those things that's gonna plague me until I have proper understanding. But it's like the notion of inner space exploration. Like when going back to times when I was in the Golden Dawn. This notion of astral projection versus scrying. Whether you're going out there or whether it's coming to you, like, is there a difference? How does that happen? Like, and this is why both those books speak to me, because it talks about that topology, like you said, and it's amazing. An
interesting idea. It's like, when we shift our frame of reference on the spectrum of consciousness, let's say, and we move our awareness up, like, for example, let's say we move our awareness up the Sushumna during meditation, and we're using these vector concepts, like up and down and inside and out, because we have to use this, like, this kind of why I mentioned, like, topography. It's like we're mapping something, but then we know that those are just kind of linguistic games we're playing.
Yeah,
with
sure.
Type of consciousness that is unlimited. It's like, Ramana Maharshi would say, like, they're the air inside the pot. When I break the pot, it's the same air.
Yeah.
We have to play these games, and I think those quote games we play are very important, because that determines things like neuroplasticity, the development of consciousness, how our brain functions, how our nervous system functions, and then we can discover unique angles of understanding by doing that. And just like, we talk about Advaita Vedanta or non-dualism, and people often say, oh, well, non-dualism or Advaita Vedanta is very simple. Actually, it's not simple at all. Pop Vedanta is, if you just have like a little meme and they put a picture of Ramana Maharshi and they just say, everything is one, namaste. It's like, well, okay, that's just what he said on one day. That other days he was reading scripture and talking about mantras and talking about consciousness. And so I think those kind of nuances, and as you know, in Buddhism, they have, there's lots of things to talk about.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Tons of scrolls to pull out and discuss things. All those are very fascinating, and they're important ways for us to experiment with those. And once again, we're back to the same, we're experimenting with the embodiment of consciousness.
Right.
Yeah.
The other thing that sticks out to me too, as we're talking about this, is there's a sense in reading both those two books, Golgotha and Entering the Desert. I got this weird, how to put it? It's the same sense that I got from reading, say, Song of Solomon, in this notion that because of my upbringing, and I'm sure a lot of my a lot of the listeners in Western culture, flesh is bad, flesh is wrong, and going back to what you were talking about earlier, not only is it not a prison, it's play, it's fun. Sure, it hurts, but that's part of the game, and I felt the urge to say that right now, but the other thing that you just reminded me of too is there's in Lakudi Maharan, Rabbi Nachman talks about the idea in chapter 26 about how he asks, he's talking about the idea of a chick inside of an egg, right? And this chick has passed. Are you familiar?
No, this is
okay.
Yeah,
and he's he says that the chick is dead, and he says, where did the spirit go? He's asking this to other rabbis, I'm sure, everybody's dumbfounded looking at him. Where did it go? And he says, the same place that it came in from, and it's that same idea. When you said the thing about the breaking of the pot, it's like, wow, yeah, that's an awesome way, that's another analogy. It mirrors so many other things that I've been enjoying right now. There's another book in Gödel Escher, where he talks about this notion of how one of the ways of human learning is through analogy, and these analogies that they give us, it's amazing, that kind of thing,
Yeah, those are very important concepts, and many of the Buddhists, of course, they would have the endless discussions and like even like those faux debates,
right,
where they in a way to educate the mind, and that those kind of analogic thinking was very important and can really give very important insights. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to quote something from Cult of Golgotha, and ask for your thoughts. What you meant by this. It reads, and I don't have the page number. It's common today for individuals to apotheosize science and psychology as the only viable options for spiritual worship or so-called esoteric experience. The Golgotha current radically opposes such modern conceptions and sets the empty shell of secular humanism as perhaps the ultimate example of the virus of modernity. Can you talk a little bit more about the virus of modernity?
Yeah, thank you for bringing it. That was the virus of modernity was a concept I kind of introduced in entering the desert, and then I continued those concepts into Cult of Golgotha, because one of the underlying themes that I really wanted to explore and kind of present in Cult of Golgotha was these systems of control, these different kind of, and I guess we could call them archonic systems of control from using verbiage from Gnosticism, or we could even use like Steinerian ideas like Ahrimanic. I use that a lot. Mm-hmm. But it just means some type of limiting of the expansion of the human consciousness. And I liked the idea of the virus concept, and keep in mind this dramatically predates the past 2 years. so that was written before that. But it was more informed from my medical knowledge, and I was thinking about, the concept of virus being something that can infect someone and they don't even realize they have it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
And they can be kind of silenced, and then it can be replicating it, and they don't even know. And not only do they might not know they have it, they can spread it, right, and not knowing they're spreading it. And then the virus also kind of like has an almost parasitic relationship with the host, right? If there's no host, there's no place for the virus to live. So those concepts were very much in my mind. I was kind of thinking of that and some of that. And so I thought that's a kind of a new concept with many of the ideas we have today in our contemporary world is very obsessed with secularization, for sure. Scientism, that, turning science into a religion, which I always try to get people to examine the important works of Mary Midgley, and that the sociology, her writings on that are very important. And then that kind of tied in with the concept of what that phrase of, well, I'm spiritual but not religious, right, which I just, that phrase just makes me nauseous when I hear that. And I understand what many people are trying to convey with that, but often it comes off as sounding lazy to me.
Yeah, no doubt.
So I think that's where that idea was coming from. My concepts that I introduced in Cult of Golgotha, which were very, wide ranging of experiences I had from a youth up until the present day, and the different ways they interacted over my personal Gnostic path. I wanted to emphasize that none of these experiences and none of these engagements with what other people might perceive as discarnate intelligences, those weren't symbolic. They were not just a figment of my imagination or my mind talking to me or just a psychological experience. It was something real. So that was one aspect of that. And that was key to fighting that concept of the virus of modernity, that you know, the active exploration in a world which is alive, diverse, not homogenized, not standardized, was a very key part in humanity's consciousness being able to expand. If that makes sense. There's a lot there, but that's it in a nutshell.
Yeah, you know, when I hear the phrase myself, I always, for some odd reason, it makes me think, you know, I like the idea of being a pacifist without self-discipline. You know, that's
right.
You know, and I, like you said, I get it. The intent is good,
yes.
but you know, it still misses the mark.
Yeah, I totally understand what a lot of people are saying, and you know, I understand where they're coming from, because they've probably had a horrible experience in an organized religion, which was where there was trauma or manipulation or abuse, which are very sad, frank, and I understand that, but it doesn't mean that we give up the discipline and the responsibility of using established systems of spiritual development.
Right. Yeah, no doubt. That's a perfect way to put that.
I often wonder if a lot of people in the contemporary times are drawn to what I call pop Vedanta or pop Advaita out of its seemingly simple nature. Like, oh, that just seems like a simple way. I don't have to do much now. Right. You know, like, you know, that'd be like reading a book on Taoism and saying like, oh, this concept of sitting in oblivion sounds easy. I dare not think of it. That's what I want to do. But then when you study the systems, you're like, my God, this is going to take 20 lifetimes. And I'm not joking. You know?
Yeah, absolutely.
My teachers, they would often say like, yeah, this is good, because if you've made some interesting progress, so maybe in the next 8 lifetimes and they're not joking, you know, and I'm like, you have to be like, okay. That brings us back to that space concept. That means our consciousness has to dramatically expand, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a concept in Sanskrit called smriti, which means spiritual memory.
Okay.
And it's something that we want to cultivate and do. And that's one of the things that analogical thinking develops, and study of scriptures and the memorization of scriptures will stimulate certain parts of the brain. And when the smriti or spiritual memory is expanded, then our awareness of the dramatic different lengths of karma and experiences we have opens up. And so we have more patience and understanding to do these larger projects. Because many of these things will take lifetimes to achieve, even though people might say, well, I don't believe in different lifetimes.
Right. I
understand that too. But from these systems perspectives, it takes a lot of work and a lot of time. And once our spiritual memory is expanded, we can kind of grasp that a little bit better.
Right.
We don't expect a dopamine hit every 2 minutes on the phone and to get some award instantly. Well, these things are very long range plans.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, you know, that makes me think about the notion that when I wrote to you about Ouspensky understanding, and I'd like us to talk about that if we can. But you know, Ouspensky and Gurdjieff both talk about that notion of, you know, I had the thought and I lost it. Give me a second. There's that notion of, you know, having multiple eyes. I mean, you know,
absolutely.
I've done a certain meditation practice where, you know, I work on just trying to remember one eye, and I can't even do that for 2 minutes, let alone, you know, what it must take for some of these practices for somebody to gain the merit or to gain the expansion that you're talking about, you know, where that takes eons, you know?
Yeah. And and once again, we're talking about really interesting experiments of embodiment.
Yeah, no doubt.
Yeah, it's like, how can we, with this limitation, this kind of corporeal limitation of the nerve of consciousness, and then we're having to do these practices to maybe perceive that our consciousness exists in several dimensions at one time.
Right. Yeah.
If eyes, you know, and I think that the virus of modernity concept is directly connected to that concept that Gurdjieff would have of that people are food for the moon.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah.
Definitely can that for sure.
There, the other one it makes me think of too is Colin Wilson's. Is it Mind Parasites?
Mm.
You know?
Yeah, I cite that in the Cult of Golgotha.
Right. Yeah. I saw that and I was like, yeah, I know that one. That was.
Yeah. There's some very interesting text, and I found that was it helped a lot of people understand some of those concepts. So I wanted to be sure to kind of cite that in there. Right. And talk about how that works. And then, there's some interesting relationships to that when we talk about concepts of like Qliphothe, right? For sure. And there's some, and that's definitely some interesting concepts that can be connected to Bon practices, code practices, and then definitely Agora practices, right. Of that type of relationship of different entities in our consciousness, and even some concepts in Haitian voodoo. About our consciousness feeding something. Right. It could be a symbiotic relationship, or it could not be. It depends on that. And there's those interactions with the spirit realm from a tantric perspective can be neutral. They can be beneficial, or they can be predatory. Yeah, and that's okay. It's just that's how the world works. It's So we just need to be aware of that.
I'm going to jump around here a bit in the way I presented the questions to you to begin with, but since you brought up those different paths, one of the things that's fascinating about your work is, about you in general, is the bridging the gap between some of these, what might seem like different pieces of the puzzle. And when I mentioned it to you, was this notion, if you look online long enough, and I don't mean you personally, because I understand your relationship to social media and technology, per Cult of Golgotha, but when one looks around it enough, you can find an argument for and against anything. And
that's true, right?
I remember. It's been roughly about 10 years now that everybody was up in arms about cultural misappropriation and syncretism, and can it be authentic if it's this, or can it be and that's I was curious if you are of the same. Is that just mental masturbation? Because I look at what you do, and I look at some of the other people I read, and again, like I said, you're bridging gaps that other people might not otherwise see. And what's more is, I can't talk about a path. I can't tell anybody about the path of, say the Golden Dawn or Vajrayana or anything, mainly because I'm a student and I like to keep my mouth shut when it comes to stuff like that. But also because, it's my personal path. It's what I can tell you what I've experienced. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there. But those are all important concepts. Yeah, I think that underlying, I tend to look at reality in some ways, and sometimes as Mencius, the Chinese philosopher would. I tend to try to assume the better of people. I try to assume that people have good intentions.
Right. Sure.
I try. Sometimes they don't.
Yeah.
I think that the concept of culture, of criticizing cultural appropriation, I understand, because that in many ways is kind of related to what we were talking about this homogenization, this devouring of uniqueness of cultures, and then just turning it into this vapid monoculture and not respecting something. So I do understand that, and there's some concerns there. And what happens is a lot of times if people don't understand the deeper aspects of any particular culture and they just take the surface things, it becomes very diluted. It becomes very cheapened. And then it's very sad. And I've seen this happen a lot, within Chinese medicine over the years. We historically, Chinese medicine, of what we even were presented as Chinese medicine was something that Mao and the People's Republic of China just put together and presented, and then we had to finally over time unpack that and see what was pre that. And so these aren't easy topics to, you almost have to be like a detective to go through it. But from my perspective as a devotee, as I'm a practitioner of Sanatana Dharma, or I'm comfortable with saying I'm a Hindu. I know that even that word Hindu could be cultural appropriation, because that word was a creation. It was never historically used in the Sanskrit text. I wrote about, that's a common academic idea. But I think that, if someone is going to study a tradition, they should be very respectful, and they be ready to spend a lot of time, being a student and learning it. And then before they speak about it, and then to try to respect it and to honor it. But I think that concept wasn't so strange to me probably because of growing up in martial arts. Right. As a child, the teachers were all typically from a certain specific lineage, and you were taught to respect that lineage, and you were representing that lineage. And so there was a chain of command, and there was a whether we call it a sampradaya from India or a lineage holder, that was something which always made sense to me. And I had a deep passion and respect for systems of philosophy and spirituality from India. So I ended up devoting my life to that. And if someone was to see my daily practice in my life, they would say, Craig is a Hindu. But I'm also was born in America, and I was born in a unique Western culture, and was raised in a very syncretic, beautiful, open family environment where I was exposed to Southern mystical Catholicism with Creole Haitian influences that just permeated my consciousness. And so I can't ignore that those things did not inspire me, and I respect that. I respect those things. And so I always found it fascinating to look for bridges to build as opposed to building up walls. And I think that's what, ideally, we all should hope for that our spiritual practice should allow us to build bridges with other individuals and other communities instead of building walls between them. And so I think that's why I loved about the complete diversity, and I call it mystical tolerance in India. It's just insane. The eclecticism of what because we throw that word around a lot today, tolerance. But in India, it's it's like 50 different versions of something, all tolerating each other. And they might argue in different ways, but they still respect each other at the end of the day, for the most part. Much more than we see in other areas, So I think that's always something that I found it interesting to build bridges. And then I had a lot of teachers over the years that asked me to.
Right, sure.
I had teachers, can you please help see a bridge here? I think there's some connections we can form here. And so I felt it was kind of my duty to represent that and do that. And that was also influenced by, Chinese medicine, Ayurvedic medicine. The history of both those was a constant evolution of ideas grounded in the tradition. Each practitioner would master a system and then probably have their own unique ideas, and that would build upon that. But they didn't discard the old stuff. They just said, "Oh, I'm kind of coming up with a new idea." And you can see that same thing in martial arts systems. They're different, but they were evolving. And so I think that it's very possible to build bridges, but to do that, to build these bridges between these systems, requires a deep devotion to learning, a deep respect for the uniqueness of each culture, and you need to be able to entertain just as many ways as they're different and respect that, and as many ways as there's similarities and respect that. Right. And I think if we can do that, then really cool things happen, really beautiful things happen. You don't have to boil everything down into just this mono concept, but it's not easy. It's hard to do that. It takes a lot of time, and to do this for me, I had to make a lot of choices in my life. Like I had to choose that, I wasn't particularly interested in having children. I wasn't particularly interested in doing this. because that would take away my time from traveling to China, traveling to India, spending my time learning all these things. I had to give up a lot of things that some people would want to do socially in order to do that. But to me, that was interesting, right?
Right.
I was okay with that, but it was definitely, not easy. And so I understand it when it's hard for people to do that or hard for people to see that. And then I understand why people want people to respect that. And they don't like it when they see people just cherry picking different things.
Sure.
And so, because I understand that too.
Yeah.
That hopefully that shed some light into my concepts on that.
Absolutely. There was a post you'd made on Facebook a week ago, I think, maybe longer, where you were you had spoken to a friend that you hadn't spoken to in years, and they said, "Oh, you're still doing the same thing, huh?"
Yeah, that's something constantly.
Yeah.
Are you still doing acupuncture? Are you still doing qigong? Are you still running? Are you still doing kung fu? Yeah. I'm like, yeah, totally. I will be doing that forever. But I think that's indicative of our time, right?
Right.
It's part of it's indicative of the cultural contemporary mindset, and then that's kind of rapidly been speeding up as from the 70s into the 80s into the 90s, and now it's like people are just jumping around to stuff constantly.
Right.
It's not find people sticking with something anymore.
Well, and the other thing that speaks to is that question that I was going to ask you about, as far as Ospensky's book, Man's Possible Evolution, or the Psychology of Man's Possible Evolution and Understanding. In there, and I'm going to paraphrase, but he says something to the effect of, I can tell you that a ruble was a piece of Russian money at a particular time, but that tells you very, very little. But if you know that, say, in 1920, the ruble was 3 times the value of, say, a pound, and again, I might be misquoting, but the idea is such that that gives you another bit of information, and not just information, it gives you that understanding to say, this is the value of this thing. This is what that might mean to somebody in 1920s Russia.
Right.
And that goes right back to what you were talking about, as far as, I think that's the only way to build those bridges rather than walls. I mean, because you have to be a good architect. Otherwise, what would be a bridge will become a wall.
Wow, that's such a beautiful way to say it. Absolutely. Yeah, that's very insightful. Yeah, we can use those concepts of architecture. Yeah. Love that.
Yeah. So going from there was this is what I was going to. Okay, so something else that piqued my interest that I saw that you wrote again a couple of, say, weeks ago. It was the notion of occultism as subversion. I have my own thoughts, but what's the problem with something like that for, say, a modern practitioner or just somebody who's beginning on the path?
What how are they seeing occultism as a type of subversion?
Right. Yeah.
Well, I think that that subject is huge too, because I think when we look at occultism per se, and we talk about it being something which is supposed to be secret and hidden, and there has been a type of kind of manipulation of that and turning it into something where it became people's self-identity. Right. And people, and then I always ask people too, like, well, what are you turning to the occult for? Like, what are you looking to get out of the occult? And I think that's a very important question, just like we would ask that out of anything, but particularly the occult, because if we use the concept of occult or secret teachings, they were usually secret for a reason, because they either were dangerous, they were tricky, they were challenging, or all of that. And so I think that I often ask people and wonder, like, well, what is their reason for doing that? Why do they want to do that? Or how are they trying to self-define themselves as that? And then also too, it kind of ties back into those systems of control I was talking about in Cult of Golgotha. It's like, usually, occultism is about breaking systems of control and breaking through barriers, breaking through things which are limiting us, as opposed to creating new limitations, which I think is odd. When I see anything in the occult seeking to limit, criticize, stop, like sanitize it or whitewash it, it's very strange to me when I see that, because that you can't really do that with some of those more radical concepts. They're just wild and unpredictable. It's kind of like trying to take a wild animal and turn it into a pet. That's a tricky thing to do. So I think the best I can say is, like, I'm just always want to ask people, well, why are you studying the occult? What are you hoping to achieve? And how is that contributing to your self-realization as a spiritual being? I think those are important questions. And then if we can, at least it opens up a doorway for interesting discussions.
Yeah, no doubt. And that makes me think about the fact, one of the other people that you quote in Golgotha is Pascal Beverlyrandolph, and
he's such an important figure.
And, what's funny to me is, I have friends who, for lack of a better term, I would call them edgy occultists, right? And
sure.
And I say that because, they have this notion that, there was a time I was, I had all the intent in the world to become a Rosicrucian, whatever that might mean.
Yeah.
And by today's standard, that's such a tame ideology, compared to my edgy friends. But if they met somebody, say, like P.V. Randolph, that would throw all those ideas out the window.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think Pascal Beverlyrandolph is such an inspiration to me, and just an awe-inspiring figure. And, obviously so underappreciated. That's a shallow way to say it, but it's true. Yeah. And his contribution to, like, very esoteric knowledge was huge. And I don't think he got a fair, or in my opinion, a fair shake, right?
Right.
So I thought, I wanted to show how important his work was, and hopefully get some people to look back at it,
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, for sure. So I'm glad you brought that up. That's a key part of that book. And then, of course, his radical ideas about so many topics were just and they were crazy back then.
Right. Yeah, for sure.
He really had a lot of, like, confidence to try to do that at a time when there's a lot of things that were against him for coming out like that. And I respect that. Yeah.
I'm going to quote you one more time.
Sure.
And probably more than one more time, but one that I really enjoyed was mental qualities are more important than mental visualizations.
Right.
Can you talk about what are some of these mental qualities, and how can they be? I imagine most anything can be practiced. There's always a gateway. Is how would one practice these mental qualities? And
yeah, I'm glad that was something that I think about a lot, and I talk about a lot, because we tend to a lot of times in spiritual practice, people tend to think of the concept of visualization, right? And visualizations can be helpful. They can, especially if we're visualizing a certain, let's say we're visualizing a yantra, or we're visualizing a color, or for example, in esoteric or tantric Buddhism, you're visualizing a deity, right? We know that those things have power, probably more power depending on the quality of the object, right? If you were visualizing a Buddhist deity, or one of the Dasha Mahavidyas, I would think that would have more quality than if you were just envisioning a contemporary rock band's album, right? There's that quality but oftentimes, eventually on the spiritual path, excessive visualizations limits the ability of the consciousness to actually evolve. And so visualizations in many ways are very, I don't want to say beginners, because that implies some kind of, like, pejorative hierarchy that a lot of people don't like to hear. The beginner is weak and the advanced student is stronger. All these kind of games people struggle with their mind. But if we can think about a topic like qigong or kung fu, and I'll give two examples. One would be in kung fu, they would say, you're trying to reach a high level of competence, and then there's a level of competence called like conscience incompetence,
right.
which means I know that I'm not any good. I know that I don't know this technique, and I'm hoping the teacher can give me ways to get there. And then eventually I work on this technique and I reach a level of conscience competence, right. Which means like I'm trying real hard. I'm doing pretty good at it, but like this brings up your concept of the coffee, but I'm still doing it.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. No doubt.
Want to reach is this level called unconscious competence, where the thing is doing me. Like I don't even realize I do the technique. I don't even realize I'm doing it. That's how they'll test you to reach a higher level, And in some of the Chinese schools, the old translation, they would call someone a technician. Mm-hmm. And that was not necessarily a compliment.
Right.
They were kind of saying like, oh, they're good. They're a good technician, meaning almost like they're like a robot.
Yeah, it's empty.
They've memorized the moves, but if you deviated a little bit from those moves, you'd expose them, Right. But this unconscious competence, you're not visualizing anything. You're not thinking, okay, I need to move my right hand to my left. You just do it and you just respond. And that's the same thing in qigong. If we say like, I want to move, I want the qi to sink. Right. Let's say I'm doing a seated meditation, a Taoist meditation. I want to see the qi to sink down. Oftentimes people say, visualize the qi sinking down. But as soon as you've done that, you've lost it. Right. So
now I have to fold the qua.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's certain mudras, and there's a certain mindset that almost kind of like coaxes something just to happen. Let it spontaneously happen. Right. And that's kind of what we're hoping for. That's the mindset that we're trying to get to. And so you'll often see high level qigong practitioners or really high level teachers who teach qigong will say, "Don't visualize this. Just let it happen. Don't visualize this. Let it happen." And it gets confusing because someone says, "Well, wait a minute. It was helping me in my last class. I was visualizing it." And then sometimes they would say, "Well, yeah, okay, but you need to move beyond that." And other times they're saying, "Well, then you were just still imagining it, right?"
Right.
You were. So I think that's the thing is we're trying to get beyond that subject object thing, which is very hard to do, and we get little glimpses of it, and it's not always constant. But that's kind of what we're shooting for. So the constant visualization, it's like we can think I'm a good person, I can think I'm really confident, I can think I'm really cool, or I can just be confident.
Right. Yeah.
But so it's kind of, I was thinking of that concept of mental qualities are more important than mental visualization. It's almost like a sutra idea. It's like you can really unpack that. And a lot of that has to do with like the gunas, sattva, rajas, tamasic, our state of mind, what we're putting in our mind, how we feed our mind will eventually have a certain resonance. And then if we make our body a certain resonance, it just becomes easier for things to settle.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. You just you put together another piece for me with the idea of body, speech, and mind right there. Just like what I'm feeding my mind is it's got to be the same as what I'm feeding my body, or
yes.
That same quality, right?
Yeah. And then at a higher level, that's when you move into really radical. They talk about that in Vajrayana. They talk about it in Tantra, other Vedic or Hindu tantric type things. Is it as that process refines, then the substance you consume means less and less, right?
Right.
The wild teachers, the wild people, the demon Yeshe who just wants to drink a gallon of sake and do his calligraphy. Please leave him alone so he can be because he's talking about they're moving beyond something where the qualities matter. So it has a very mystical approach, but then it also has a very practical approach.
Staying on that subject of mental quality, is that what Madhu Vidya is? Is that what honey gnosis is?
Yeah, that's really interesting. Madhu Vidya is basically an extraction. There's substances. There's this idea of rasas. It's called rasa, or taste or flavor.
Right.
And everything has a rasa, or a taste. Sometimes bitter, sometimes sweet, sometimes a mix. Like you said, you said beautifully earlier. Like sometimes it's painful, but sometimes it's nice. That's just how it is. It's like flavors. Like not everything's going to be sweet. After a while, if all you eat is sweet stuff, it's like, now I want something bitter. And then after a while, you train your palate. You maybe will crave something bitter, or you crave something sour because your palate's more educated. It's not just like modern research knows the majority of people only really taste or crave sweet and salty.
Right. Yeah.
But they just eat these they can't. That's why I love this concept of. I love wine. I love spirits, wine and beer both, but I really love the concept of wine and like biodynamic farming and the cultivation of the palate and how you can pick different things up based on the terroir of the environment. It's pure alchemy, and it's all related to a spiritual concept. And so the concept of Madhu Gnosis or Madhu Vidya is through our experiences in life, we can extract something from that. And as we extract something, we could call it a lesson. I guess we could call. There is an aspect of that, like I had an experience, I learned something, I let it go, I extracted what I need to learn, I've moved on. That's very healthy, right? To get people just to move on. But even deeper, there's an essence in things which nourishes our nervous system, but it also nourishes our pranic body. And so the concept of the honey is just that all these bees were going to all these different plants and extracting something and then going back and then refining it even more. So both honey and ghee are really powerful symbols of alchemy and tantric sciences.
Yeah, so that definitely makes sense.
Madhu Gnosis or honey Gnosis is about learning to extract the taste from life and learning to appreciate things in life.
Yeah. Like we were talking about earlier, the simple essences. Yeah.
You can go to a mountain, for example, and you can stand by. I can think of some like really generic examples, like someone goes to a mountain, a beautiful mountain, and someone stands on a beach, and just being there, they feel better.
Right. Yeah.
And there's an extraction even in that, just that sense of feeling that, of course, we can extract something visually. We can extract something auditory wise. We can extract something through the sense of smell. And then we can absolutely extract it through the sense of touch.
Right.
So all that's going on, which is why they would say, doing Qigong or mantra in nature was like crazy powerful, right?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm going to back up for just a second when we were talking about the flip side of visualization versus qualities. And it's not exactly the same, not the opposite of that question. But what I wrote here is, again, I was quoting you in part at least. If we must beyond the physical senses to contact ultra beings, what role does the imagination play in the cult of Golgotha or the Golgotha current? And using John Keel's analogy of the drop of water, this can be observed or perceived by others with the tool of a microscope, but my imagination and experience may differ from yours. So is imagination somehow related to the sacramental vision?
Yeah, wow, you're asking the best questions that I've ever been asked. So I'm truly honored. Thank you so much.
Yeah,
that is a huge part of my next book, Desert Meditation, Gnostic Cartography, is going to be an extensive discussion of that question.
Outstanding. Okay.
So that will be coming, but we can just talk about it right now. Is that's something I entering the desert, I really wanted. It almost is perceived as a criticism of the imagination, right? And so because we're talking about the mirage, breaking away these potential illusions we have, so that we can have a different type of vision, the sacramental vision. In the next book, I wanted to kind of develop that a little bit more so people can understand that eventually the imagination can be, we can almost think of the imagination can be polished, it can be refined to function at a different level. And that is a key aspect to encounters with what we refer to as the imaginal realm.
Right. Okay.
So, that's bringing in, concepts from Henry Corbin, which were very influential to me about this imaginal realm of being literally another dimensional realm. It wasn't just the imagination, but there might have been a little leap of the imagination to get there. And a lot of that is, there's some really important ideas in the teachings of Novalis and his concept, the magical imagination. And we get a lot of those concepts through our use of art and music and sound. And so I think imagination is a very important role. It's just, how are we wielding it? It can almost be like a knife or a sword. It can like cut through things. It can cut us.
Right. Yeah.
So we do want to refine and so that's kind of what a lot of, because we even say in Kung Fu, we say like, someone's not going to be a good practitioner or a good fighter if they don't have a good imagination.
Right. Yeah.
Because a lot of times you're shadow boxing, or you're coming up with ideas, or you have to visualize what's going to happen in your mind, and you work, and there's different types of imagination. There's an imagination where I can just imagine a way of putting different colors on a piece of art, or I can imagine a way of writing a certain blues song. I grew up playing guitar, so I could say, but then I could also just spontaneously do something, and it just comes through, and I'm like, whoa, I heard something, or I felt something. So it's like a different resonance of that imagination. So those things always fascinated me. And then in occult work and spiritual work, we can absolutely see that happening and explore and that, try to refine that so that we can filter out what might just be total bullshit, and what can be the madhu, the honey, the essence of it, that we can start to use it. And that takes a little work to do that, but it's totally possible.
Okay, outstanding. That definitely clears that up too. Okay, so here's another technical question for you out of Golgotha. Are you familiar with the idea of, and I'm sure you probably are, but need to ask, God form assumption, like as far as like Golden Dawn? Okay, so in Golgotha, you talk about assuming the mask. Is that closer to, would you say, God form work, or like say writing a spirit?
Yeah, I would say it's more like there's different. I would say it's probably more like a spirit writing you.
I'm sorry, that's how I mean to say it. Yeah,
that for sure. Definitely, that has an aspect of it too. And then I think a lot of it would be just creating a certain environment where the encounter with the other happens, and then can transform and through that actual encounter, there is a transformation of the experiencer's consciousness. And so maybe they had to wear a certain, we're talking symbolically here, there's a certain mask that was used to enter into a certain mind state. Mm-hmm. And that was something that allowed you to get to a certain level. Then you had the experience, and then you could pull back, and then that's fine as well too. And other times we're trying to pull away masks, right? We're trying to melt away these masks that we have to try to get to some kind of alchemical purification, rather to burn away the dross and the astral sludge that might be around on something. And our encounters with the other and our encounters in the imaginal realm helps to clear that out.
Right. Okay.
And that could be so. I don't necessarily, for me personally, the majority of my tantric practice has been, I would say, more oriented on bhakti, which would be devotion and worship, as opposed to assuming a God form, which is like what you're talking about. Yeah. So mine would be more my personal one would be more propitiation, worshipped, and then honoring that particular Ishta Devata. And then as a result of that, there was some very interesting encounters were happening, and there could be a transformation in my consciousness in that. And then once that happens, then sometimes, like, I always say, sometimes they start to grab you, you're not grabbing them,
Right.
and that's okay. That's fine. That's an interesting part. There's a true relationship happening there.
Yeah. There is, let me see, I've got the question somewhere else here. Okay, so quoting you on the blog on January 5th, you have one can understand me in truth, my transcendental name, forms, qualities, and pastimes only by bhakti.
Oh, right.
With that, and then another thing that I have in here, and I don't remember if I was quoting or if it was a question, but I think it's a quote from Golgotha. It reads, it is often the most divine spirits that are called evil simply because they lead a lifestyle contrary to the norm.
Right.
So that leads me to a big, something that I have been scratching at for a long time in my own work. I'm going to use the Matrix quote, it's like the splinter in my mind. And that is there any part of spiritual work, or let's just say work at its highest level, because it doesn't matter whether it's physical or spiritual at some point, these
Right.
are just polar, right? But do you find that everything it seems like everything rests on paradox?
Sure.
Is that do you think that's a jumping off point or a starting point for the work, or how do you deal with paradox in your own work?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I think it's I don't know. I would say it should be both a starting point and a destination and a doorway.
Right. Yeah.
Be all of that, but it can be very hard for people because so many people are resistant to nuance and paradox. Right? They don't like that. We don't like that as a society. We don't like it as a culture. But that is definitely the realm of the imaginal, the realm of the soul radiates paradox, and that's a very important concept, and that's something which we can look at that concept in the Upanishads when they would say neti, not that. They would go through this endless is not that. They were just like cutting away. It was these in between points about what it is, and so I think that we're talking about definitely liminal spaces and these little midpoints between the almost like a strange attractor, right? It's almost before a waveform collapses into what it is, then it can merge in and out of that. Before that, what was it before that? Then it collapses into a waveform and it's something, but then it leaves. And so in different dimensional states of awareness, we're looking at things from different angles. And so Kali appears to some people to be very dangerous and ferocious, but as you understand the concepts, and number one, you can say we could use Kali as a great example, because we could say on the surface she appears as very ferocious and scary, and then you can cognitively explain that away. Oh, that the garland of skulls really means your addictions. That's just your ego. Oh, she's really scaring away the demons of your desires. Then so we can rationalize it away. But then through the lens of bhakti, then we don't even have to rationalize it away anymore. We just see something different. We're not seeing in such a harsh dichotomy. We're almost like, I always sometimes used to say it's trying to break us out of this kind of like artificial manichaeism, dualism of just everything being like good, bad, this, dark, light, as opposed to just there are these shades on a spectrum. And bhakti in particular has the ability to transform the senses, the mind, and particularly the doors of perception, so that we can see things in a different way, unlike any other practice. And so that's what you see. Krishna would constantly talk about that. Only through bhakti can you see me in this form. only through bhakti and the purification of bhakti and the deepening states of bhakti. There's different levels of bhakti, right?
Yeah.
And so only through those higher stages of bhakti will you see me with my gopis, or where you see this appearance of that, because it's like you can't get there through just logic. You can't get there through just book memorization. There has to be what they're kind of insinuating, that you're moving beyond dualistic thinking, obviously, but you're also moving beyond expectations, and you're open to paradox, and you're open to different things. And that's a really interesting question, because that was something that was in my mind when I was writing Cult of Golgotha, because on the surface, there's some things in Cult of Golgotha which seem a bit ominous, right? Sometimes, but it's because our explorations of the other can be quite unsettling.
Yeah, no doubt.
And that doesn't necessarily mean it's bad. It just means it's different and strange. And that can shift us sometimes out of our awareness, and sometimes we need that to shift us out of our awareness. And so I think that's where, and hopefully that's shifting us out of our expectations, the ways we want certain things to be. A spiritual person looks like this. A spiritual person says this. They don't do A, B, and C. That's a big problem.
Yeah.
Be happening. And I understand where people are coming from, that, because we do want a certain qualifications for something, but other times we have to be a little bit more open and say, okay, things aren't always like that.
Right. Yeah. That makes me think of Chogyam Trungpa's cutting through spiritual materialism.
How many times, if I had $1 for every time I mentioned him, and then was crucified by somebody for, he's not, just you mentioning him belittles all the trauma that was inflicted on, and he was a raging alcoholic. I'm just like, just stop.
Yeah.
They can't, it just reaffirms what you and I are talking about.
Right.
It's like, this is very complicated. Nobody says this was going to be, even he didn't say it was going to be nice, right? What was his, something like, congratulations, the path is like you're thrown out of an airplane with no parachute.
Right. Yeah.
Happy, something like that,
Right.
And it's true,
Yeah.
And so, and you can have, and I've often said this before, some of my best teachers of Asian arts, East Asian, like Kung Fu and Qigong, have been insane.
Yeah.
I'm legit what society would say totally insane, maybe dangerous, definitely,
Yeah.
And so, but I was like, whoa. And so I was lucky, I think, that I got to see that and was exposed to that. And then luckily I had other reference points where I could start to understand that and not let it go to an extreme, but also to understand that sometimes it will. And life is a mystery. Things are complicated.
Yeah.
Not always black and white. There's a lot of gray, and where else do we get? Any spiritual path and occult path, that's exactly what it is. It's right. Going to be predictable. It's, that kind of brings up, the image of the old Western or, ceremonial magician inside of the circle,
Absolutely.
So safe in the circle, and the demons, it's just like, come on, that's not,
Yeah. It doesn't happen that way.
That's really interesting. So.
And I won't talk about my trauma too much, but I'm very grateful for the One Golden Dawn order that I was a part of for so many years, where the imperator of that order was, for all intents and purposes, an abusive asshole of a teacher, and he is not, and I admonish anybody from ever learning from him, but he is not crazy wisdom. But the difference is,
that's the point.
Yeah,
no, that's a very good point. Yeah, because you can have a lot of assholes use that to just be an asshole.
Right.
Yeah,
he was not that, but thankfully there were enough of us. There was an event horizon where we all started to realize, hey, this guy isn't that. And so we broke ties. And so I'm forever grateful for that vitriol. People don't realize, and this goes back to what you were just saying, you tell them a key component of alchemy is vitriol, and they think, okay, great, that sounds wonderful. I can't wait to remove all of this tarnish from my person, until you go through it.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, totally. But that is a very
okay.
complicated, fascinating subject for sure.
Yeah. So what I wanted to end on is still paradoxical. I'm a fan both of literature and poetry, and I've been taught by all my teachers, though, because of my love of those things, I become one of those students who becomes very literal, and I have to watch that myself. But the great paradox of poetry, is that it goes back to that notion of it's not just words or sounds, it's the gestalt of an experience if it's done right.
Absolutely.
And so how does that, what does the role of poetry play in your work and in your life?
So what a great question again. Poetry is hugely important to me. I have a deep love for literature and poetry as well. That was part of my academic background, but then it became just part of my spiritual life. Right. And I have deep love for Bhakti poetry, and then love writing poetry because it expresses things that standard prose can't. And then I'm also very, very interested in the concept of writing as a magical tool and linguistic expression as a magical tool. And so poetry obviously falls into that. And so I think poetry is incredibly important because it's the closest we can get to a glimpse of the Atman. I think poetry can offer that to us. It's poetic thinking, poetic expression. And like you said, because it takes all these different images and sonic, it can be everything from alliteration and a sonic quality to the actual imagery and the alliteration, which brings the mind to a certain memory of something else. And then that's like a leaping off point. And then it can bring us to the doorway to the imaginal. And then oftentimes once we're at the doorway of the imaginal, the imaginal can grab us, or we can just peek in, and then over time start to cultivate that more and more. Because it's kind of like, it's like that's a good example of that honey gnosis.
Okay.
Right. If you read poetry, you can really extract something from it. Good poetry.
Yeah.
Or bad poetry, you can extract other taste. That doesn't taste good. It's not, there. But some people can't do that at first because they're not used to that. So you have to teach them, right? You tell, here we're going to learn why they were doing this certain style and what they were trying to say. And then after a while, you can develop an appreciation for it. But I think that it's very important to convey deep spiritual concepts that are limited by simplistic, dualistic linguistic structures. That's why things like Sanskrit, of course, Hebrew, and Chinese ideas and Japanese writing and Tibetan, it can have like 5 different levels of meaning for each word, right? So it just develops this different kaleidoscopic thinking.
Yeah.
And that changes the circuitry of your mind, like literally. And so you start to perceive differently, you can think differently. And that wasn't by accident. They wanted that to happen,
So just for my own edification here, do you know the poetic tense in Chinese? Have you heard poetry in that?
Yeah, I used to joke about it because, I would spend, my lifetime memorizing, thousands of Chinese medical texts. And I would be in China, and then I'd be here, and I would have this stack of books. Mm-hmm. And then my Chinese friends would come in with like this little pocket book. And I would be like, what's going on? And they'd be like, oh, the poetry, that everything that's in those books we have a poem for. And I was be like, you've got to be kidding me.
That's
And then
amazing.
they laugh at me and we'd laugh together. And then they eventually would teach me. I'd be like, oh my God. What was happening was it was almost like a sutra literature.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
And they were songs from the bread boat. It's in Wing Chun traditions. They have the same thing too. There's like these songs which contain the teachings and that even the forms we learn are like sutras. They contain a teaching hidden in there. You have to learn it, memorize it. So I think that that's a big thing in Chinese medicine was they would have songs and poetry that would help they were both mnemonic devices to help you memorize things, but it was literally trying to form like circuits in the brain so that you were owning that knowledge. You
That's
weren't
amazing.
Beautiful. Yeah. And so that's why I taught myself medical Chinese so I could at least read that, right? I couldn't read, I couldn't teach myself, I could, but I didn't teach myself conversation, like having a discussion about a TV show in Chinese. That wasn't interesting to me, but it was interesting to me to learn how to read a medical text talking about an allegorical way of talking about the stomach and the heavens and the earth and Taoist thought, and how the symbol for qi was actually, and it could be translated in many different ways, but you could look at it and see that it was a fire cooking rice and the vapors were rising up in the actual form of the letter. And you're like, whoa, and that would already stimulate your way of thinking. We didn't have that in English. It's like, oh my gosh. And so, and that's the same thing with Sanskrit too. I worked on that as hard because there's certain things you get from that you just can't get anywhere else. It's like a key. And then, but it's even more than a key. It's like a key that opens, but just by holding it, starting to transform you. And that's, once again, it's kind of funny we're ending it, because that's transforming our embodied consciousness, right?
Right. Yeah.
We're in the body. We're trying to memorize all this information. And then so they're developing all these unique ways to make it, quote, easier, but it's also just more beautiful. And you're owning it at a deeper level by that way.
Yeah.
So, I'm so happy you love poetry.
Yeah, absolutely. My inroad, just a real quick aside, my inroads into understanding that was Lewis Carroll, and by that I mean poetry as an experience, is Lewis Carroll's like nonsense, like Jabberwocky, like. Oh
yeah, right.
Yeah, when I heard that the right way, when it was performed the right way, it's like, holy shit, this is amazing,
Yeah.
But again, that's a digression. Do you want to give any details on the new book? Is there anything you want to talk about forthcoming? How people can contact you, if you like contact?
And this year, in the next couple of months, the paperback Tantric Physics will be coming out.
Oh, outstanding! Okay,
be very exciting because we'll have a lot of new poetry added to it that wasn't in the hardback. That's what I'm going to add that. So that'll be in this coming year. And then in the following year, 2023, I'll have Desert Meditations, Gnostic Cartography out. And then I'm working on another book called The Supermental Evolution, Gnostic Imaginarium Letters, which is a more in-depth discussion of the work of Sri Aurobindo. And it's
outstanding.
And its relationship to Krishna. Okay. And so there's a lot of projects going on that I'm very excited about. And then, of course, I'll always write other things on my blog just to get it out that I don't have to wait to put out in a book or something like that. But I am very excited for the Tantric Physics to be in paperback. That way, people who didn't get a chance to get the hardback that sold out, now they can get it easily.
Yeah,
that too.
And some of us who do have the hardback will have something we can highlight, because doing that in a hardback book is verboten to me. So
I just love paperbacks.
Yeah.
I'm just kind of a geek with paperbacks. I love beautiful books, hardbacks, but paperbacks to me, I don't know. There's something, it's like that I just love. So, and I'll be sure that in this new version, it'll have a lot of cool new poetry and things in it that weren't in the other ones to make it very interesting. So,
outstanding. How you want to give out the blog address?
Yeah, they can go to my website, which is ayurvedaaustin.com, and it'll have a link to my blog. I have two blogs. I have one which is more like philosophical, spiritual writings, and I have another one which is more about just straight Chinese medicine and Ayurveda, so that they can go explore either one of those. And that, I'm fairly easy to get in touch with. They can see, I try to use social media in a way that can inspire people,
Absolutely.
occasionally make people laugh. I don't take it too seriously, but it's fun. It's nice. We can use it in a good way. That's our responsibility, is to spiritualize technology,
Right.
Totally. And not let technology, dehumanize us.
I will also put links in show notes, both on YouTube.
Oh, that'd be one. Yeah,
yeah.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
and
for sure.
They can go to Anath Publishing's website, and they'll have all those links and things on there as well.
Right. Craig Williams, thank you again. I appreciate it so much. This has been a wonderful time to spend with you.
No, it's truly my honor. Thank you for the just beautiful questions. I really appreciate that.
Absolutely. Hope to talk to you again soon.
We will. Take care. Namaskar.